This is Ichariba Chode, an Okinawan Voices and Stories podcast, episode 12, Shimakutuba, Exploring Languages of the Ryukyus. Haisai gusuyo hajimite yasai, wanne Erika Yaibin. Hello everyone, nice to meet you. My name is Erica. Welcome to Ichariba Chode, a podcast featuring Okinawan Voices and Stories. In this podcast, we aim to create an open and safe learning and growing space where we will explore alongside guest speakers what it means to be Shimanchu. Our intention and prayer for this project is to cultivate our own knowledge about our histories, celebrate the amazingly diverse and resilient culture of our people, inspire other Shimanchu of all generations and geographic locations to be curious about their histories, and to preserve those precious pieces of our identity for future generations, and of course to have fun along the way. We'll laugh, we'll cry, we'll stumble around and be human. We hope you come and join us for this evolving journey together. We're looking forward to it. Yuta sarugutu unige sabira.
Hi, Tai, and welcome to a special episode diving into a few languages from within the Ryukyus. We are joined by Micah Mizukami, who is our special guest co-host for this episode.
How's it? My name is Micah Mizukami. I am from the island of Kauai, born and raised, currently living and working in Honolulu. My background is in linguistics. I did my master's in language documentation and conservation at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and I currently work in the field of oral history. I also taught in the Northern Ryukyus on the island of Tokunoshima for 3 years on the JET program. So being a mixed Japanese Uchinanchu, fourth and fifth generation, and having been in the Northern Ryukyus and studied linguistics, this topic is really near and dear to my heart. So thank you for inviting me here today.
Ippee nifee debiru, Micah, and we are so grateful for you to be here co-hosting with us. Today we are covering 3 Ryukyuan languages originating from the following locations known in Japanese as Amami Ōshima, Miyako, and Yaeyama. We are honored to welcome 3 linguists as our guest speakers today, Madoka Hammine, Michinori Shimoji, and Martha Tsutsui Billins. Our conversation today will include a discussion on language from various perspectives. We hope to dedicate a full episode to each of these languages, so be on the lookout in future seasons. And Madoka, if you don't mind sharing with us your introduction.
Hello, everyone. Oh, hi, Tai, or Kuyo Manara. My name is Madoka Hammine, and I have been working on mainly language reclamation and revitalization, focusing mainly on the Yaeyama language, which is my father's family's language. And among the Yaeyama, my family is originally from the Miyara village in Ishigaki Island. And that's my heritage language. And I have been, I did my field work for my PhD in that village, and also Yaeyama diaspora community in Okinawa. And it's my pleasure to join this episode with all of you. I think the Shimanchu podcast It's so wonderful. I have been introducing this podcast to my students. Yes, nice. Thank you for inviting me today.
And Shimoji Sensei, can you go next?
Okay. Thank you for having me as one of the guests. My name is Michinori Shimoji. I forgot to say Zaukanmo which means how are you doing in my subject language Irabu Zaukanmo. And I'm a linguist working on the Irabu dialect of Miyako Ryukyuan, which is severely endangered. And this is also the language of my father and my grandmother. And I didn't speak that language until I was a child. But after I'm 30 or something, I started to learn this language and describe that language as a PhD project. And I wrote a PhD thesis entitled The Grammar of Irabu at the Australian National University in 2008. And now I'm working on working on this language, and I'm also working on Kyushu dialects of Japan, which are also severely endangered. And recently, I've been getting interested in documentation and revitalization things of Ryukyuan and other Japanese dialects as well. So this is a very good opportunity for me to learn, much about language revitalization thing and documentation thing. So thank you again for inviting me as a guest.
And Martha, if you don't mind introducing yourself as well.
Ugamin Shoran. I'm Martha Tsutsui Billins, and I'm a sociolinguist. I work on Amami Ōshima in Setouchi town. And I did my PhD looking at honorifics in Amami, Setouchi variety. So I'm interested in how people have continued to use honorific registers in the face of language loss. Amami Ōshima is also endangered, like Shimoji Sensei mentioned. And about 10 or 12 years ago, it was estimated that there were approximately 1,800 speakers. It's very difficult to count number of speakers, but that gives you a rough idea. But of course, in 10 years, all the speakers are very elderly. So we've lost a lot. So I work there, and I'm an outsider linguist. So I'm actually not from Setouchi. I'm Nikkei Yonsei. But I'm very, very grateful to have the opportunity to work there. And thank you for inviting me on your podcast.
No, thank you all, including Micah, for joining us on our podcast, because it's really wonderful, I think, to be able to talk about these different language varieties on these different islands, because I personally, I guess growing up on Oahu, and of course, many being from the island of Uchina, don't really get to hear about these different, or not different, but other island groups. And we do have diaspora from those islands living abroad. So I do think these conversations are important to have. So again, I really, really am so grateful that you are all here to talk with us today on this podcast about a very, very important subject. And hopefully maybe this will inspire people to pursue linguistic careers or academia, and to study their own languages and or other languages to help perpetuate this within the community. I don't know if you want to add anything, Micah, before we continue.
No, just everything you just said was great, and I hope for the same thing.
So getting to our questions, I do want to thank Ridens and Micah Mizukami for helping create and organize these questions. Links for their profiles will be listed in our show notes. So the very first question we have is, what is your connection to the language that you're studying? And or what inspired you to learn about the language linguistically?
I was inspired by that language only after I studied that language linguistically. So, for example, I didn't know anything about the language before I started to learn that language, even the pronunciation, even any single word. I started describing Irabu language or Miyako Ryukyuan when I was a PhD student. And this is because I had to choose one language for description as a potential topic for PhD thesis in Australian National University. And I picked up that Irabu language because nobody at the time, described any single Ryukyuan language in the form of a descriptive grammar. So, I wanted to describe the language as a distinct language, as a distinct language which is independent of Japanese or any other Japonic language. Many people thought that it was only a Japanese dialect or something. So I wanted to make, this trend change a little bit to, the focus on the Ryukyuan language independently of Japanese dialectology. So this is how I started. And I was inspired by that language because, it has a lot of linguistic features which are not found in Japanese or even in any other languages.
It's really interesting listening to how linguistically it got you inspired to kind of learn more about the language. It's just I don't do languages very well, unfortunately, which is why everything but English is bad. So really, this is really interesting to listen to. So thank you so much for sharing. And Martha, would you like to go next?
Sure. So I ended up working on Amami Ōshima kind of by a bunch of happy coincidences. I was living on Shikoku. I was an ALT in Tokushima-ken, and I knew that I wanted to pursue graduate school for linguistics. And I was really interested in language documentation and indigenous languages. And really by chance, I ended up meeting some people who were from Okinawa when I went there, just on holiday while I was living in Japan. And so really just by meeting people, I became interested. And then I'm trying to remember how, but I met another ALT who was living in the place that I now do fieldwork, and his name is Shannon Grippando, and he's also a linguist. And I really owe him everything in terms of my linguistics life, because he told me if you're looking for, an interesting language, Amami is really interesting. I didn't know anything about Amami. And he was like, yeah, and Seitouchi is a good place. And he introduced me to my host families before I even arrived on the island. And if I hadn't just met him, I don't know what I would have done. But he, because I had met him, he vouched for me within the community. And I was able to really make strong connections from the start of my fieldwork. So just one thing really led to another. And maybe if I had met somebody different, I might have ended up on a different island. But through a series of happy coincidences, it ended up being Amami Ōshima.
And then Madoka-san, could you go next, please?
I already told you a little bit in the introduction, but my father's originally from Miyara village in Ishigaki Island. And since when I was growing up, I've often visited my grandparents. We are very close. And also my grandmother and I looked very similar. That people all of the people in the village told me that. And I I was very close with my grandma, and and also because of my surname, Hammine is very particular, and people, even on Okinawa Island, people ask me where my family is from, and I say, okay, Hammine. I grew up mostly in Yonabaru, but my father is Yaeyama. That's why I was very aware of this kind of differences between different languages. Not languages, but maybe the names and the cultures. And also my grandmas in Ishigaki and my grandma in Okinawa, they speak differently. Like they speak to me in Japanese, but sometimes, for example, my grandma in Ishigaki tell me something like, "Oh, anji anji dara," とか "anji anji," とか Korean. This is when the people say, "Yes, that's right," or something like this. And then in Okinawa, my grandma from Okinawa, she used to be a school teacher, and when she gets angry, she speaks to me in Uchinaguchi, and that was my connection. But I didn't think of this experience until I became much older, and I read many books about languages. In Scotland, actually. In Scotland, I went to Scotland to study my master's degree. And there I realized that people in Scotland, they have a language called Scottish Gaelic. And some people, they speak Scottish Gaelic, and they have education in Scottish Gaelic, bilingual schools, and so on. And I started learning this bilingualism. And I realized, okay, my family also had different varieties or languages or dialects. And I didn't have a chance like them. That's what inspired me to learn the language of my ancestors. Yes, that's my starting point.
Thank you so much for all of you for sharing that. And I think it's so interesting the different ways we come into language learning and how people, I guess, connect us into learning these different languages. So Micah, would you like to lead us into the next question?
Yes. Shimoji Sensei, I have actually a series of questions for you. I guess for most of the listeners to this podcast who are not linguists, could you, I guess, break down what is a language? How would you define a language versus like a dialect or a variety? And then how would you apply these terms in the Ryukyu Islands?
Okay. Yeah, it's very extremely difficult to define the language as opposed to the dialect. But one famous definition, informal definition, is like a language is a dialect with military power. So, it's a very socio-political notion rather than linguistic notion. So linguistically, it's impossible to draw the borderline between dialect and language. So it's possible linguistically to say that any local variety is a distinct language. So as a linguist, I describe each local variety as a distinct language, but in Japan, it's a recent recognition that Ryukyuan languages constitute distinct language groups rather than Japanese dialects. And I think many local people do not feel, I don't know, but many people would say that, many local people would say that they don't actually care about whether, their local varieties are called dialects or, distinct languages. But some people would argue against being treated as their language being treated as a distinct language because it, sounds like a politically very strong attitude, right? Some Okinawan people are very sensitive about this problem. But at least linguistically, I treat each local variety as distinct languages.
So can you talk about the genetic relationship of the different varieties and language groups in the Ryukyus?
Yeah, Ryukyuan languages constitute one single language group in terms of genetic relationship. And the Ryukyuan languages and the Japanese language constitute a single group. So they are often called sister languages, stemming from the same parent language, which is called Japonic or Japanese Ryukyuan. So Japanese Ryukyuan branch off to Japanese on the one hand and the Ryukyuan on the other. And the Ryukyuan languages, fall into two major groups: Northern Ryukyuan, which contains Amami to mainland Okinawa. So this constitutes Northern Ryukyuan. And Southern Ryukyuan is composed of Miyako, Yaeyama, and Yonaguni. So we have two major subgroups within the Ryukyuan branch. So, and within each branch, there are a variety of sub-branches based on historical linguistic reasons, which I do not go into detail this in this podcast. But if you're interested in this topic, you can read a pile of work which was written a lot of scholars. Fortunately, most are written in English, so you can access to. So I think the best introduction to this topic is by Dr. Thomas Perra, and whose chapter in the Handbook of Ryukyuan Languages. Maybe this is the best intro to this topic. Handbook of Ryukyuan Languages, which was published in 2015 by the Muton.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that was a really easy, accessible explanation of Ryukyuan linguistics. But I also have a background in linguistics. So how was that for you, Tori? Did that make sense?
I think so, but I might have to re-listen to this episode to get the whole complete picture, because I do not follow linguistics/languages very well. So I probably will have to go over. But I also want to mention that we will hopefully find a link for the Handbook of Ryukyuan Languages and put it in our show notes as well for anybody who is interested. And moving on to the next question for Martha / everybody else, if you're interested in answering this question, is why are some varieties from neighboring communities not mutually intelligible, even though they belong to the same island?
Well, I think this question ties nicely into the how many languages and what is a language, what is a variety, or what is a dialect question as well. So one thing I think people who aren't familiar with linguistics might not realize is that it's not like you just walk into the next village and suddenly cannot understand a single thing when before in your home village you were completely fluent. It's very gradual, at least in my experience on Amami Ōshima. So maybe you go to the next village and some of the phonology, some of the sounds are a bit different, and people have some phrases that they say differently from you, but you can kind of understand them a bit. I can give an example. So in Seto-uchi, they say umore for welcome, but in the northern part of the island, they would say imore. So it's not that different. You can kind of, you can figure it out. But as you would go further and further, it would become less and less intelligible, and you would have a harder time understanding what people were saying to you. The other aspect is, over time, geographical boundaries will often lend themselves to linguistic diversity. So in PNG, Papua New Guinea, there's like 700, 800 languages, supposedly, and it's very diverse, right? So like lots of mountains, lots of like dense jungle, valleys. There are obstacles where people were separated for a very long time, and then they could develop their own distinct varieties to the point where they are no longer mutually intelligible. I don't work in PNG, but this is just what I've heard. And in the archipelago, you would have a similar situation where, on Amami Ōshima, people would be separated from where Micah used to live in Tokunoshima. I think it's like a 5-hour ferry ride, right, Micah?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, so that's like pretty far. So if you are, in today's world, it takes 5 hours on the ferry. So back in the day, it takes a while to get there. So you wouldn't have much interaction linguistically, and that could lend itself to two distinct varieties evolving over time.
I have a follow-up tangent question. I guess thinking back to things that I've read, which may not be correct, I do remember reading that, at least for Uchina, people from like specific, I guess, towns or villages would not necessarily go to like, I guess, a village 2 villages over. And that sometimes had an impact, I guess, on linguistic variety or diversity. Would that be also true for the archipelago as a whole, or?
I've heard something like that in terms of social classes. So all of the upper class people might live in one area and stay in that area. And then people who were of the lower social strata were maybe not physically separated that far from one another, but they wouldn't interact. So, yeah, I mean, has anyone else heard anything about that?
Yeah, social class, right?
Mm.
Yeah. This also happened in Miyako, and maybe it's more typical in Yaeyama, right? In Yaeyama, there are a lot of people from the mainland Okinawa living in the island, and I'm not quite sure whether they, those upper class people, they had a daily contact with the local people. I don't know. How about that, Hammine-san?
Yes, to add to this question and matter and Michinori-san's, Shimoji sensei's answer, I've heard from in my fieldwork that Yaeyama is like a United States of Ryukyu because people come from different islands. And for example, people who work with the ocean, like fishing, people on Yaeyama Island who work with ocean, like fishing, they often come from Itoman. And when you go to Yaeyama Museum, the museum in Ishigaki City, you will see all the sections of fishing tools. And all of them are written in Uchinaguchi, not in Yaeyama, because those are brought from the community in Okinawa. So, and because of the migration of people, the still native speakers of the Yaeyama language, they have awareness of who belongs to the higher social class. 役人、ユカリプト and the farmers, 農民 and so depending on the family's social class, sometimes I was told that, oh, I shouldn't use this personal pronoun because your family is not eucalyptus. So definitely there are differences between the regional and the social state, between regional and social status, and also depending on where people are from, their ancestors are from. It's very complicated.
Thank you. Yeah. Appreciate you letting me come in. I'm really enjoying this conversation. It's going to be really hard for me to be quiet. But I love everything that you've been saying, especially with the relationship to the evolution of language. I dropped that in comments, but basically how it shifts along these different axes. Like one, you have sort of geographically, and then you add this another dimension of space, time, history, and how things naturally evolve in time, and then sort of this human generated construct, what people value. And actually, this is a complete, not a complete tangent, but I was talking with my mom, and we were, there was this, I'm forgetting his name, but he was a famous boxer, and he was from Yaeyama, and they were interviewing him. And my mom said when they were doing the interviews, her family would get very nervous because he wasn't able to speak in Japanese, the polished way that people would. And the reporters asked him what his favorite hobby was. And he said, oh, umi o aruku no ga shumi desu, or something like that. My hobby is to, literally in Japanese, is walk on water. And then, they were just kind of joking, like, oh, he's Jesus Christ, or his hobby is to walk on water. But I think the way that it was explained to me is umi o aruku in that context actually means I go fishing, which is a very natural thing to do. But I don't know if you have heard that at all, or if that is accurate. And I see some smiles. So I'm hoping that was a relevant addition to the conversation.
So, 海を歩く, I think it's maybe uchi na Yamatoguchi nano kana? Probably it's influenced from the local languages, how people talk. And I've also sometimes people from mainland get confused how young people talk in uchi na Yamatoguchi, which is influenced, variety influenced by Ryukyu traditional languages. Umiachi probably in uchi na guchi. 例えば, for example, I've also heard that 死んでない、飲んでないとか、死んでないとか、このハリネーヌかな、多分、Yaeyama. And this kind of special use of Japanese is very confusing for people from mainland Japan. Probably Michinori sensei knows much more about this topic.
Influence from uchi na Yamatoguchi thing.
So, hi. Shimoji sensei is probably you are a native speaker.
Yeah, I'm
Yes.
also a native speaker of uchi na Yamatoguchi, which is heavily influenced by local Ryukyuan language, but it's a kind of mixture, a bit of Ryukyuan and Japanese, standard Japanese. But for example, as Madoka said, nondenai, which means nonde is a drink, nai means doesn't exist or not, or it's a negative marker. So nondenai means don't drink. But in Ryukyuan, nondenai means have drunk. It's opposite. Nai is it literally doesn't exist. So drink and there's nothing left. So which means have drunk. So nondenai for us, I mean for Uchina people, it's have drunk. But for standard Japanese people, don't drink or didn't drink or something. So this kind of miscommunication often happens.
What were the other examples that Madoka-san shared? Could someone explain the other examples?
飲んでないと。あとなんか死んでないも、I have heard that people says, もう私のお姉さんは死んでないから残念だね。And then, for a standard Japanese speaker, it sounds like it's very sad because my sister, elder sister passed away. But, あれちょっと私のお姉さんは死んでないから残念だね。It sounds like my sister is still alive, so it's very sad. But the speaker meant that because she passed away, she is sad. Yes. Do you understand? 死んでない。for うちなRyukyuanうちな大和口の人は、it means that she has passed away, but for speaker of mainland Japanese, it means she's still alive. So it's the opposite meaning. It caused misunderstanding.
Those are very different misunderstandings or like extreme examples. I can see how that would be very, very confusing. But thank you for that digression. I really appreciate that. And I think when people are able to have concrete examples of like, oh, this is how something could play out in a very real way, it sticks with them. And I think that's like the aliveness of the language and then bringing attention to it. So thank you both, Michinori Sensei, for your expanding on that, and Madoka for sharing the examples.
Yeah, I think this is a really cool concept. Like you have, I don't know if worldview is the right word, but these ideas from these Ryukyuan languages, in this case, Uchinaguchi, that is, and the younger generation is using Japanese words with the same Ryukyuan concept. So is that kind of like a pigeon? I see Erica has this question. Is it like a pigeon, or it's been creolized, right, at this point? But would you call Uchina Yamatoguchi a pigeon?
So, some scholars call it a creolized Creole language, but in the situation of Creole, maybe there's no clear target language to learn. But in the case of Uchina Yamatoguchi, there's a clear target language, which is a standard Japanese, which was educated in school. So there's a slight difference between the typical Creole and the typical Uchina Yamatoguchi situation. I'm not a specialist of social linguistics, but how about that, Madoka-san and Masa-san?
I've seen it called like mixed language. Substrate and superstrate causes the mixed language. I think that's kind of a neutral term as well, because sometimes there's a social implication of calling something Creole or pidgin. But how about you, Madoka?
I've also seen people call it mixed language. I think it's maybe like Shimoji Sensei said, it's a little bit different from what linguists might call Creole. general. Yes. But I think that Uchina Yamatoguchi is interesting because it's also a way that young people, maybe it's part of their identity and culture. And more research probably is coming, I hope, on Uchina Yamatoguchi.
I'm super loving this conversation. I think it's absolutely wild that there's so much variety in defining the language or the way that we speak, and kind of looping it back to like identity. It's like, okay, if we can't agree on the language that we speak and like, you know, what it's called, like, what does that mean for individuals when they are trying to self-identify, or, you know, especially when it comes to reclaiming of a language or anything like that. And so it's just a passing thought that happened as we're trying to describe. Is it like, you know, I'm like Googling like Pidgin and Creole and, you know, all of these like identifiers and trying to understand how that would fit. So thank you. I think I don't know if anybody wants to add anything to that particular piece. I just, you know, for me, like, this is so not my area or my wheelhouse, and I haven't spent a lot of time on it. And it's all very fascinating to kind of get the foundational pieces in understanding a language that I think many people in the diasporic community are trying to become more in touch with, to know themselves more, to know their ancestors more, and hopefully reclaim and enliven the languages again.
Yeah, thank you for that comment, Mariko. Should I explain the difference between a Pidgin and a Creole?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, Amina.
So when we refer to Pidgins and Creoles, the Pidgin is a language that is spoken out of necessity when different languages are spoken in the same area, and there's no way for these groups to contact or communicate with each other. So a Pidgin language is developed. They borrow from each other's languages as a way to talk to each other. And then if that language then gets passed down to the next generation of children as their first language, they grow up speaking that Pidgin language as their first language, and it becomes, it develops its own rules, pronunciations, vocabulary, all of that, and it becomes what is called a Creole language. So sorry, this completely went in a different direction that wasn't planned for. So just wanted to clarify that. And then it's really cool that we have these terms like mixed languages that are being used in Uchina and Okinawa. So yeah, I need to read more about that. So this next question is for everyone. Could you describe really briefly for us what are some of the distinguishing features of these different language varieties that you're working on or that you're studying, that you're working with?
My subject language, Irabu, it has a lot of things which are distinct, but if I choose to pick one, I would pick phonology. Sound system is quite distinct. And Irabu and other Miyako languages have vowel, which is very close to consonant. So, for example, pstu, PS is a single syllable, which is composed of P followed by S. S functions as a vowel. So it's like Japanese pa, pi, pu, pepo, pa, pi, ps, pepo or something. So S functions as a vowel. So this kind of phenomenon is very rare, of course, linguistically. And this feature is also found in Yaeyama, but Miyako has a lot more sounds which consonants which function as vowels. Like in my Irabu dialect, we also have L sound. L sound functions as a vowel, like burburgasa. It's a kind of potato. Bl is one syllable. B followed by L. So L functions as a vowel here. So irabu has a lot of these syllabic consonants. So it's a distinguishing feature of this language from other Ryukyuan languages, among many others.
So I haven't done much cross-linguistic research, but I can talk about what I think is so interesting and special about seitouchi in Amami, and that is the honorifics, particularly the honorific imperatives. So an imperative is a verb that you use to make a request or make a demand. And in Amami, there are many different imperatives that have different levels of different levels of honorifics. And as English speakers, it's kind of tough to conceptualize what honorific registers are, but if you speak French or Spanish, then you are familiar with like the tu usted dichotomy. And Amami has even more. It has at least 4 different levels like this, and they can go for you can express both horizontal distance. So if I am just meeting someone for the first time and I am an Amami speaker and I want to show respect, then I would use a certain form with this person who I don't know very well, which would be quite different from how I would speak to my siblings or my children. And then also vertical distance. So the way I'm speaking to my boss is quite different to how I'm speaking to my husband. So these 2 axes can be expressed with the honorific registers. But should I give an example? Yeah, okay. I prepared some examples. Okay, so if you want to ask someone to lend you something and you want to use the ichiban piku, most honorific way of saying it would be karachi tabore. So tabore is the imperative. So like kudasai in Japanese. So that's the most polite level. If you want to be a little bit below that, then you could say something like karachi kurin shore or karachi shore. So it's tabore shore. And then the next one is kuriri, which is plain. So no honorific at all. So this is how you would speak to your peers or your family members. And then if you want to be really casual, you would drop the imperative completely, as you do in Japanese as well, when you drop the kudasai and just use te form. So then you could just say karachi and no imperative. But what's cool about these in Amami today or in seitouchi today is you actually see them a lot, even though the situations where people would use honorific registers are somewhat limited. So these days you wouldn't see people using Amami at work because Japanese has become the language of prestige and business and modernity on the island, unfortunately. So people use Amami as a home language. And what you might expect is that you would only see the casual registers because this is what people used at home before. But actually, you see these honorifics a lot, even though people are using them now in a different way. So they're using them with their kids, with their close family members, with their friends. So that's kind of exciting because, or at least it's exciting to me because I think people are repurposing an aspect of their language that they no longer have access to or no longer have an arena to use that register. And instead they are using it in a different way. You also see Amami in linguistic landscapes. So signs, people, if it's a Amami owned business, they might have a sign that would have an honorific or any kind of Amami on the sign, which is kind of cool to kind of signal we are a local business, I think. So I think that's one distinct feature of Amami is this repurposing of the honorifics into a we code.
That's super cool. Thank you. And thanks for coming prepared with the examples. And Madoka-san, do you have any examples of distinguishing features?
I am I am still learning the Yaeyama language, but one thing that struck me when I started doing my fieldwork was that there are different kinds of we, watashitachi in Yaeyama, and there are in Miyara we have banda and bagada. Nihongo, in Japanese we have only watashitachi, I think, usually. And but in Yaeyama, people distinguish if we is like if you are talking we as a part of group, and if you have listeners who are not part of your group, you use different word. So that was a little confusing at first for me, because I have working with two other new speakers of Ryukyuan, Haisu Fan del Rube and Akira Uema. I don't know if listeners know about them. They are new speakers of Uchunaguchi, and we have a community radio together. And when I introduce my program, I try to speak in Yaeyama, and I say, Kuyomanara kyun banda podcast Shikitavori shikaitumi hayu. So if you say banda, it means our podcast, but it's excluding the listeners. But if you say bagada, it means that listeners are part of the podcast. I think that's very interesting for me, and it was a little bit at first it was a little difficult for me to get used to this concept. Yes.
Madoka, do you want to explain new speakers? Because maybe that describes lots of listeners as well.
そうだね。So I try to use new speakers as a term to describe people who learn and acquire their heritage language, not in the family, but in like as a second language. When I, like myself, I didn't have a chance to speak and learn my heritage family's language when I was little, but now we are learning the language and we try to reclaim and revitalize it. So these people are, I use new speakers to refer to those people. So a lot of the listeners of the Shimanchu podcast are also new speakers. We can be new speakers together.
Yes, that is definitely me. I really love this. I feel like it's really wonderful, and I think back home to Hawaii and how people use Hawaiian in English sentences as well. But I think it's so fascinating, like, and wonderful that even though all these different language varieties face different forms of discrimination or erasure, that all of them have found a way to survive with the current speakers, whether it's in like a pidgin form and or it's people are actively learning, as it was or is. And it's so inspiring to hear all of you talk about, even though you're talking about, I guess, about the defining features of these languages, how they I don't know how to like word this properly, but how they're functioning in contemporary times and how it's growing and evolving with us, and for everybody and anybody who chooses to continue speaking. I think it's really beautiful. And to go to the next question, which is a little bit of a segue from what I was talking about. Michinori brought up an interesting conversation about standardization in Martha's podcast Field Notes, and definitely listen to her podcast if you have not. So the question is it possible to standardize each language group in the Ryukyu archipelago? And what are the pros and cons of the standardization of these language groups? I feel like this is a kind of heavy question. I guess because I was listening to Michinori, Sensei, if you would like to go first.
Yeah, I will go first. The standardization has both pros and cons, of course. And personally, standardization is I'm afraid of standardizing Ryukyuan languages into one, for example, Shuri based language, and because all other minority languages will die out because of this. And for example, Miyako people, they don't actually feel that they are part of Okinawans. They call themselves Miyako and Yaeyama, and so they have different identity. So standardizing Ryukyuan languages would harm this local identity. So this is a very negative part of standardizing. And technically it's extremely difficult to standardize one language because there's no established orthography, there's no established way of teaching, and who will teach? The question of who will teach, because teachers are almost below 60s, under their 60s or 50s, so they don't speak Ryukyuan languages anymore. So before we start standardizing, we need to develop teachers, and it will take much time. So technically speaking, it's also difficult, extremely difficult to standardize Ryukyuan. How about that? Other people, Matsu-san and Hammine-san?
I think thinking about Amami, which is not even part of Okinawa Prefecture, if there was to be some movement saying like, okay, we will standardize, and of course it would be Shuri variety that because it is the largest, but that language is completely unintelligible with Amami, and Amami is part of Kagoshima Prefecture, so I don't think anyone would get on board with that. I think it would what comes up for me when I think about this is what Madoka has called minority within a minority situation, where the smaller Ryukyu communities kind of get forgotten, like Yaeyama and Amami. So I don't know if it would be possible. But what do you think, Madoka?
I am also very suspicious about standardization, but I also noticed in other contexts. For example, when I was doing my PhD in the final year, I met people in the northern Scandinavia, in Norway, and in Sweden. There is a small language called Kuven, the Kuven language, and they are trying to revitalize and reclaim their language there. And I've seen a documentary about how if standardization could be implemented better, in a good way, that could possibly empower the community people. Because I've seen in the documentary where the native speaker of the Kuven language, they feel that they can't speak the language because there is no textbook, dictionaries, anything. But when the speaker saw the picture book, they were so happy. Oh, at first, of course, they felt very difficult, like resistance. But she started crying because, oh, this is how my language should be written. So that could be, I don't know. But I know that standardization have both advantage and negative advantage and disadvantages. That so we cannot do it in a way. I think it's important that we discuss among different peoples and stakeholders and maybe speakers and learners and teachers together. Maybe that is necessary.
I definitely think about teachers being so integral to the revitalization and continuation of languages. I guess I have two questions, but I will ask the first one. Kind of going back to the question that I just asked, for example, if Amami created a standardized language, so to speak, for Amami specifically with relation to Amami, I guess one specific Amami language, what would be the pros and cons? We kind of already talked about it, but
well, I think it would probably it would then be Northern Amami. So the variety that's spoken just north of Setouchi, because they have the most, I think they have the most speakers. Micah, keep me honest. And in terms of Amami Islands, I think
I think so too. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Kasari and Uken area. But then that would leave out like Tokunoshima and Okinawa-Rabu and Yoron. And these varieties are super different. And it's kind of the same problem, but just at a smaller scale. That might be a compromise, though, to try to standardize the language groups within the Ryukyus. But I think you still run into the same problem where you're minoritizing then the smallest communities that don't get representation. So I'm really not sure what the solution is.
I although I'm not, I guess, a linguist or a speaker, I also have been thinking about that as well. Like, you get to smaller, because even if you do specifically for the island group, then you get down to the issue of villages. And I think that also speaks to the larger archipelago in general, to how you guys were talking about or how Shimoji sensei was talking about Miyako and Yaeyama. And I would assume also northern Ryukyuans would also probably not maybe potentially identify as Ryukyuan, or in English, Okinawan. I guess this would lead to my second tangent question. For your language group / town / island that you focus on, do they have a specific way that they identify, terminology that they identify when they talk about themselves? Like when I was in Ginoza, they were we're Ginozanchu, rather than saying Uchinanchu or Shimanchu. So I guess that would be my first question. And then to the larger archipelago, how do they identify within that? Because I feel like there's a lot of rose glass tinting when it comes to talking about the Ryukyuan kingdom with regards to the archipelago as a whole. So I'm curious as to what your thoughts are, or terminologies that are used for your language groups.
So when I was teaching on Tokunoshima, they were going to offer a community Shimaguchi class. Shimaguchi is being the local language variety. But then it got canceled, or it never happened. And the reason why it didn't happen is because it was one specific variety that was being taught, and the other varieties or speakers from the other varieties were like, why isn't ours represented? So I guess one way to get around that is you have to offer each variety, but that takes a lot of resources. You need all of the the teachers, instructors, the speakers for each variety to be able to offer it, or you need to standardize it on the other end of the spectrum. But yeah, I think that was a kind of a sad example of, because there was no standardization, there was so much fighting over who get to teach it that it never actually happened. So there was no opportunity for younger people to learn the language. And yeah, that's a conversation I don't really hear a lot about.
Yeah, that's so sad.
It's very sad. That example from Tokunoshima, it's because the language is connected to their identity and how they see themselves as Shimanchu. Yes, Yaeyama people, they don't also see themselves as Okinawan. For example, they say, maybe some people do, I don't know, it's difficult, but some Okinawa, when they go to Okinawa, Naha, they say Okinawa Eiku. And when they come back from Naha, they say Okinawa kara kaette kita. So I think that shows how people see themselves as Yaeyama, or even within the Yaeyama, people have different identifications depending on which village and which island of Yaeyama they are from. I don't know. Yaeyama Pstu literally means the people of Yaeyama, but I don't hear this word often. People rather call themselves, for example, Sabu-Pitu, people of Shiraho, Mera-Pitu, people of Miyara, and Shika-Pitu, people of the Shika, and Kumoma-Pitu. So they are different. I don't know if Yaeyama-Pitu is the correct or right term to define ourselves. Maybe it looks like that people identify differently depending on each village and each island of Yaeyama. So when I started doing my fieldwork, I also don't know how to describe myself. I am half, but I don't know, mixed with the Okinawan, Chinanchu, and Yaeyama, Miyara. So it's very difficult for me. And at my university, I have some students from the Amami Islands, and they don't see themselves as Uchinanchu. Definitely not.
Not at all. Yeah, completely different. But I always hear people say Shimanchu. What about you, Micah?
That's what I heard too.
Yeah, Shimanchu.
Yeah.
I know Shimanchu is kind of controversial right now, but in Amami, people always refer to themselves, that I've heard, as Shimanchu, and the language is Shimaguchi.
Mm-hmm. But I also think that...
I'm sorry. I was interested in how the concept of Shimanchu become controversial in Amami.
Not in Amami, I mean within the greater Ryukyu community. I think right now people are talking about what term should I think Tori and Erica and Mariko can speak much more eloquently about it than I can, but yeah, there's a lot of conversation right now about what term should we use.
But back to the Amami thing too, even within the Amami Islands, like I feel like each island, like there is an identity associated with each island. So yeah.
In Miyako, Miyako people identify themselves as Miyako, then that's it. They think they are different from Okinawa and from Yaeyama. And it's interesting to see that many Miyako people decide to go out for work in Osaka or Tokyo or Fukuoka, skipping Okinawa. Maybe because they don't feel close to Okinawa. Their psychological distance between Okinawa and other mainland place are the same. So they easily, decide to go directly to Tokyo or somewhere else rather than going first to Okinawa. Naha or somewhere. So it represents how Miyako people feel about Okinawa. Yeah, Okinawa is just one, outside area. They don't feel close to, they don't have any particular closeness to Okinawa. So maybe Miyako people would feel that Amami and then Okinawa are the same in terms of their identity, differences. So, but for me, I'm Okinawan. And for me, Amami and Miyako and Yaeyama are a kind of part of Okinawa. For me, even though Amami belongs to the different prefecture, but culturally, the Ryukyu as a whole is, for me, they are kind of constituted the same social cultural group. As a layperson, not as a linguist. When I remember the school days, I knew several people from Amami, and I thought that they were not mainlanders. They were more like Okinawan people from their accents, from their appearances, and from their historical reasons. How about Hammine-san? Did you, before you become a linguist, did you feel that Amami people were completely different, or they were part of Okinawa, or part of,
Yes, I have. My father plays sanshin at home, and I grew up listening to Yaeyama classical music in sanshin, and it's very interesting because there is a song which traditional from Miyara village where my father is from, but that song is influenced by Amami sanshin music. It's called Rokchōbushi. Yes, and do you know? Rokchōbushi is very, like, we play it in Miyara. People play it in Miyara, and it's. I heard from my sanshin teacher that particular song, was brought to Yaeyama from people from Amami. They had a connection before, like I don't know when, but that kind of story. I grew up listening to that kind of story, so I think that even if the prefectures are divided, but there is connection. I can see the connection culturally and appearance, and also music. Maybe because I grew up with the music around me, and that's what I heard from my teachers. だから難しい. It's difficult, but I feel that there is a connection between Amami and Yaeyama. Touches my heart when I listen to that kind of connection that I never learned in official education, but from the local knowledge is hidden, usually hidden.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Madoka-san. I love your story. And one thing that I'm feeling very deeply is just like the thread that you're weaving about like commonality and like what we share. And it's just like a really interesting story to have back to back with sort of Micah's example of like this really sad, like scarcity of resources story. And and just kind of looping this back to like the Shimanchu identity label and what's been happening in sort of the diasporic online community feels a little bit like that the scarcity mentality, perhaps, or like wanting to fit something neatly into a box to be able to label it, and maybe looking so like narrowly at a particular thing that we're not actually seeing how much we do have in common. But without going into it too much, I just kind of wanted to reference back, if anybody was curious to know what we were talking about, is the term Shimanchu, as I understand it, is controversial in the sense that it is used to describe traditionally people that were from same villages. They would refer to each other as Shimanchu. And so you would not use that word for anybody outside. Outside of the village, they would not necessarily be a Shimanchu. It's like a neighbor or something like that. They are Shimanchu, but somebody from a neighboring village, no, they are not Shimanchu. But I think what I've seen is that this word has been reclaimed or like has evolved into this term that people in diaspora have resonated with to be able to connect, because they don't, like, there are people that actually don't know where their ancestors are from. And like Okinawa doesn't feel right, or Ryukyuan doesn't feel right, and depending on what island. And so I actually think it's a really nice term. Shimanchu is like acknowledging that we all have the same, like we're all from the same place. But, you know, we are separated, but together in this like online or diasporic sense. So I don't know if that was a good explanation of the Shimanchu issue or not, but it's that there are layers and terms traditionally, and does it make sense to use them contextually now in sort of this modern way? And how can we acknowledge those differences in these labels so that we aren't causing more confusion? Especially if you're talking to somebody that's more traditional, or from, like, say, like Okinawa Honto. If they hear Shimanchu, they might be confused by it, sort of like from the examples that you gave earlier around, like, you know, shindeiru or shindenai, or, you know, and nonderu nondenai. And like Shimanchu is like, okay, are you my close villager friend, or are you like diasporic, you know? And anyway, I just think that's really fascinating. And yeah, thank you.
So I guess my question to all of you is, I guess, what keeps you working on language documentation, revitalization, and reclamation work? What's driving you? What is your hope for the future of these language communities, and for yourself?
Well, I will go first. Okay. I've just started being interested in documentation thing, but so what I've been doing is a little bit different from document revitalization. I'm working on description, but this definitely will be the basis, the firm basis on the documentation materials and revitalization processes. So yeah, what I'm doing is maybe, it's I'm not doing this for the purpose of only for the purpose of description, but for the next step to be taken, documentation and revitalization. And yeah, this keeps me working on my work. So yeah, that's it. This is what I'm doing.
And then could you explain really briefly what you mean by description?
Okay, description. Okay. Going to the field and collect the data from the speaker and compile a comprehensive grammar book from its sound system to discourse system, and with some word list, which is culturally relevant. For example, you can use this word list for local festivals and local songs, and interpreting local songs and local festivals and so on. So it's culturally relevant set of word lists, plus text, narratives and conversations and stories, rituals and songs, song lyrics and so on. So these are collectively called texts. So yeah, providing this set of materials, grammar and dictionary and the text, is called a description. I don't know about whether I'm correct, but I believe that this is a description.
Thank you for that. I remember when I started my linguistics program, I had no idea what these words meant. So I'm just thinking about the listener right now. How about you, Martha?
Yeah, I think Shimoji Sensei makes a good point about how before you can make high quality revitalization materials, you have to have a good description. And it's probably not well known outside of linguistics, but there's about 7,000 languages, and maybe only half of those are described in a way that is good. Right? Maybe about half. So if we don't have a good description, we really cannot create anything. Something I've been working on is trying to archive all of the data that I've collected, and it's accessible, of course, with informed consent from the speakers. But I think making, it's good to collect the data and produce the materials, but also to have the raw recordings available and accessible to people. So, a lot of the people I work with are extremely elderly and don't have great computer literacy, but if their grandchildren or their children can go into the archive, my materials are at the Endangered Languages Archive. If they can go into the archive and they can listen to their families speaking, then that can also be something that could be used for revitalization purposes in the future. And I also think just creating a digital legacy is really important too, because I think I've already spoken about this on my podcast, but I had an experience where between the first and second field trips I took to Seitouchi, one of the consultants I worked with passed away. And when I went back the second time, I was able to give the recordings in a good format that people could actually play on their home computers to his family. And it was really moving to be able to give that to the family, because they hadn't heard his voice in almost a year, and to be able to hear him speak his language. And the recordings I was able to capture were actually not even that good because they were kind of chaotic. It was him and his grandson speaking, and he was hard of hearing. He couldn't hear very well. So you can hear me trying to interview him almost shouting, and then his grandson also shouting and then him like kind of shouting back at us. So the quality was not ideal, but yeah, I was really moved by how important it is that these materials be in the hands of the communities and that they're actually accessible, and not just, the traditional way, unfortunately, in our field is it gets put in a box in the attic and then no one ever finds. You know about this, Micah, because of the work you do. Yeah, so that is a big motivation for me to make things findable, searchable, archived, and accessible to people, because I really feel, especially as an outsider, that it's a big responsibility, and really an honor to be able to do this kind of work and to be welcomed into the community. So yeah, it's like not something I take lightly.
Thank you for sharing that. That resonates with me a lot, working in oral history. When you get to give back the stories to the families, especially after they pass away, it's really a special moment for the families. So thank you for sharing that beautiful story. And I also think, so we talked about documentation and description, and that leads us to the work of the applied linguist. Madoka-san, can you tell us a little bit about how, maybe building off of these documentation, description, how do you do your work and what keeps you motivated in doing your work?
I think maybe the methodology I employ, I find it's very important to make the center, the relationship at the core of my work, and the relationship with the community, the relationship with me, like you, all of you, and the relationship between the researchers also, but also the community members, diaspora people, everyone. And I think Okinawa de Ryukyuan people say like chimu kukuru toka. In Yaeyama it's ksmu toka. There is a word for that, and I think that includes not only the biological heart, but also like how to care about people, how to be sensitive about other people's feelings, and so on. And I think doing language, learning language and reclamation, revitalization made me realize that it's very important. And I started doing this work because I realized that my heritage language is endangered, but that made me realize much more important things. And having access to the data that is available when we want to learn and reclaim the language, it's very, very important. So I really respect Dr. Shimoji and Dr. Dr. Tsutsui Billins' work. And yes, if we don't have data and descriptions of the language, we cannot do anything. That's very, very true. Yes. So I think the building connections like this is very, very important, extremely useful and fruitful for the future. So thank you so much.
That was so beautiful to listen to you guys speak about these different steps. And I feel like I'm learning a little bit about linguistics while you guys speak. And it's really interesting because currently I'm working as a digitization specialist. So I'm working with archives, though not spoken. It's interesting to hear how much archives actually have a role in I guess, reclamation efforts and keeping that information available, because that's very much in line with the work that I hope to also do in the future. So thank you all for sharing all this inspiring, I have chicken skin, all this inspiring work. But since we have been talking for a long time, our very, very, very last question for everyone is, what is your favorite karaoke song?
Micah, what's your favorite karaoke song?
my go-to is Chisana Koi no Uta by Momachi.
Yeah, it happens to be my favorite too.
What? Duet. I love it.
Momachi is a legend.
And it's a good song that everyone knows and can sing along to, so you don't need to sing by yourself.
Martha-san, Madoka-san.
I can't even remember the last time I did karaoke. Okay, if I can get someone to sing with me, Summer Nights from Greece.
I love that. And I'll sing with you. Yes.
Yay.
I like this lullaby by it's called Warabigami. And it's sung in Uchinaguchi, and it's I like, but it's I don't know if young people would like to listen.
That's a beautiful song. Okay. I love it when people sing that at karaoke.
I don't think I've ever heard it in karaoke, but I also enjoy that song. Or maybe not enjoy is not the right word, but I do also like that song.
Thank you again to all of our hosts and co-hosts and guests for joining us on this awesome episode. Where can we find, for our listeners, where can they find you online? Let's see, Martha, maybe we can start with you.
I think the best place for people to find me online would be through Field Notes. And on Instagram, the handle is @lingfieldnotes or fieldnotespod.com. I don't have a website. It's on my to-do list, but that's probably the best place.
Thank you. Michinori-sensei, maybe you can go next where people can find you online.
I'm doing Twitter. My account is Shimoji Zemi. It's not my personal account, but my whole lab's account. Actually, I posted one about this podcast show. Yeah.
So thank you so much. Madoka-san, where can people find you? And I think you have like a radio program if you also want to plug that.
Oh, I have a website I created with Google. And you can also find the Marin Maruse Ryukyus if you are interested in learning or listening to Yuntaku. It's not very academic at all. We try to use our languages, our heritage languages in our radio show, and we are trying to, I am and Haisen Akira. This is the title of the radio. And it's all the episodes are uploaded on YouTube by the Kinoan City FM. So you can, if you are interested in listening to Okinawan or Yaeyama, or you can go and listen to our radio.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Micah, where can people find you online?
The best one is probably Instagram. My Instagram is Mizumicah.
Okay, thanks again so much, everyone. And we'll again have all of these links on our show notes, which you can find on our site.
Would you all feel comfortable saying see you later or goodbye in your respective languages?
So do I go first? Okay. Ashiba matai, which means then see you later. Ashiba matai in Miyako.
Okay, I'm not sure how you would say like mata ne, but you could say yoroshiku tanmya osika for like thanks for a good time. or arigasama rota is like thank you so much.
I can say shikaitu mihayu ante matara. It means thank you very much. See you again.
Thank you, everyone, so much for listening to this episode. I definitely learned a lot. And mata.
Bye. Thanks for joining us. I was definitely taking a lot of notes about the different linguistic vocabulary, and it's so interesting to hear a breakdown about the different Ryukyu languages. What did you think about this episode? Was there anything you thought that was particularly interesting? Drop us a line on Instagram or send us an email. Suggest a topic via our submission form or leave us a review on Apple Podcast. We'd love to hear your thoughts. A big Ippee nifee debiru to our guest host Micah Mizukami and our guest speakers Madoka Hammine, Michinori Shimoji, and Martha Tsutsui Billins, as well as our shout out to Ridens for the additional help. You can find everyone's social media and contact info on our show notes page. Shoutouts to Marin Maruse from Amami Ōshima for providing this episode's music. The song is called Yoi Sara Bushi, which is one of the beautiful songs of Amami Shima Uta. The song is originally based on the belief of Un Arigami, the spirits residing in sisters. Links for the musician can be found at marin-naruse.com. Thank you to Emma Anderson and to Joseph Kamiya for both of their audio editing skills. And thank you to those who have taken the time to rate us on Apple Podcast. And special thanks to Becca Dahl of Ninazuma Pottery based in Ridgeway, Colorado, who held a mini fundraiser to help support the podcast. This is so generous of her, and you should check out her calendar she created as part of the fundraiser, and also the very cute tumblers and mugs that also say Ichariba Chode on it. You can find her work on Instagram at Ninazuma Pottery. Thank you to our coffee donors, Carrie Toyama and Corey Reuter. If you enjoyed our podcast, we'd appreciate if you hit subscribe on our channels. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and we'd love it if you shared with your friends and family. And of course, donations for our coffee are always graciously appreciated. Thanks for sticking around and for supporting us along this journey. And until the next episode, we'll see you next time. Mata yasai!
For this episode's fun fact. Did you know there are lots of fun language resources that exist for many of the language varieties in the Ryukyus? However, accessing these resources can be difficult for the diaspora since finding them often requires searching in Japanese. This is further complicated by the current political division of Ryukyu between Okinawa and Kagoshima prefectures. Searching for individual islands or specific villages tends to work. For example, there are many versions of Rajio Taiso from across the archipelago you can see on YouTube. There are also picture books and karuta sets that have been created. Vlogs are another fun language resource too. Happy learning!